Reputation is central to how the literary world works and functions smoothly. Reputation determines how much people get paid. Reputation determines how much attention and what kinds of attention gets paid to different writers.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff. With departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others, the college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
David Brewer is an associate professor in the Department of English at the Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. He works on the literary, theatrical, and visual culture of the long 18th century, as well as the history of the book. He is also interested in how magic works, both historically and in fantasy, and I want to ask him more about that, I think, today. He is a recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Ronald and Deborah Ratner Distinguished Teaching Award. And I welcome Dr. Brewer to Voices today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to begin, first of all, with your latest book project, which is called The Fate of Authors. It's a really intriguing title, I have to say. What are you arguing in The Fate of Authors?
Well, the fate of authors is a phrase that comes up a lot in the period, both with famous people like Alexander Pope and people that probably you have never heard of.
So the period is the 18th century, yes?
Mm-hmm. But it is the long 18th century because we like to annex several decades on either side. So I really kind of begin around 1670 or so.
Oh, okay.
So the fate of authors, as I said, is a phrase that comes up a lot in the period, and it's always about the vulnerability of authors, the ways in which authors are kind of subject to the whims of readers and booksellers, what we would call publishers, how they don't have the kind of control over their work, their reception, their reputations that they would like to have. And they complain about it, but they also have a sense that this is the way of the world. This is how things are. A lot of what that vulnerability seems to turn on is how much their reputations can be manipulated by others. Reputations are, in some ways, stories about ourselves that we're not in command of, or at least not primarily in command of. We can do things around the edges to perhaps shape them. But it turns out that reputation really, really is central to how the literary world works and functions smoothly. Reputation determines how much people get paid. Reputation determines how much attention and what kinds of attention gets paid to different writers. And this is not just in the literary realm. It's true kind of in social history more generally. This is an age before credit bureaus. And so right. Reputation largely determines perceived creditworthiness, whether or not you can borrow money. Reputation obviously is important for young women hoping to get married. And so it's a world in which reputation looms large, including for authors, but it's not how most literary historians have traditionally thought about authorship in the period. And
why might that be?
I think there's been a long-standing desire to kind of find the kind of origins of us or the origins of the modern in the period. And there are reasons why that makes sense. If you look at our political institutions, they stem, at least in part, from the 18th century. If you look at some of our, at least supposedly deeply held values, things like human rights and such, they were largely invented in the 18th century. So I get why there would be that desire to find almost a origin story for us and why it would be easier to do that in the 18th century than earlier. But that has turned, in the case of authorship, into a lot of stories about things like intellectual property. I mean, the first copyright laws in the Anglophone world did come in the early 18th century, and they do name authors. They're basically a fiction for publishers to try to get back some of their previous monopoly rights that the Parliament had taken away. But there's, I think, a widespread sense that if literary property and royalties and making a living from your work is important to writers today, and there was copyright starting in the 18th century, then that must mean that that was the central thing of importance to writers in the 18th century.
And it wasn't?
No, most writers made almost no money from their work, had no expectation of making at least direct money from their work.
Because they were independently wealthy? Or
Some were independently wealthy. Some were able to use their work as a way to get various kinds of patronage, either individual patronage from the nobility or government sinecures. There are a lot of people who were the assistant deputy inspector of wine, where they got a salary and had to show up once a year. And those were
good gig.
It's a good gig. And in some ways it's like the traditional Chicago and New York political machines, where there were just bosses handing out jobs that didn't require much to people whose support they wanted or who had done them a favor or something. But a lot of people just had other work, or they were just desperately poor, and that never changed. And so the idea of authorship as a profession at which one could earn a living, authorship that would be a self-regulating profession in the way that law and medicine and things like that are considered self-regulating professions, that's really a minority view. And there's evidence for that, but a lot of the stories that literary historians have traditionally told have been, I think, mistaking kind of the part for the whole, or seizing on the thing that seems to have the most clear continuity to now, and then presuming that that must be the whole story. And that means being pretty selective with evidence. And so one of the things I've been trying to do in this project is just cast my net much more widely and think about lots of kinds of evidence that don't usually figure in our standard accounts.
What sorts of evidence?
One of my favorite examples is shop signs.
Oh, okay.
So London does not have street numbering until the 1760s. Prior to then, if you want to find a business, either you just know where it is or you go look for a sign. In some cases, those signs are going to be fairly clear. If it's the Three Pigs or the Black Boy or something like that, then you can probably figure it out. But many, many booksellers in bookshops, booksellers is a period term for publishers. So there are publishers who have bookshops, and then there are people who just sell books, have signs that are just authors' heads. So you can buy a book at Milton's Head or Prior's Head or Addison's Head. And they're often, especially in the figures from the early 18th century, they look a lot alike. It's just guys in full-bottom wigs. And so being able to pick them out, especially if you're sending your servant, I'm not sure how easy that was. I'm not sure how well they worked as signs. But I'm interested in just the idea that an author's head becomes, and that the just general things that author's name suggests, because names are a good proxy for reputations, that helps kind of distinguish those kinds of businesses from others. And that seems to be much more about authors as a kind of particular sort of figure and individual authors as having particular associations with them. So Milton, for example, has small r Republican politics, was an apologist had what were then thought to be extreme ideas about divorce and such. So buying a book at Milton's Head may suggest some things about the kind of establishment you're going to and the kind of books that they have on offer. I mean, I guess today, if you were to purchase something at the sign of Che Guevara, that would probably
signal
suggest
Well,
something.
does this help to establish reputation, these sorts of physical markers?
Yes. And a lot of this is recursive and self-reinforcing. So someone gets a reputation for a certain thing, and then others build on that, and that enhances the reputation for that thing all the more, and so on. And that's part of what authors complained about as their fate, that it was beyond their control, that once there was a bandwagon going, it would just keep on being self-reinforcing, whether or not they thought it was fair or accurate. And so I guess part of what I'm interested in is that recovery of a period understanding of what the kinds of beings that authors were, the kinds of status they had in the literary world. But I'm also just interested in that kind of vulnerability. We have grown up in a world in which authors are either these kind of capital G geniuses who can do no wrong and have immense control over their work and their reception, or they're just kind of irrelevant. And I think there are plenty of people today who don't really think about authors one way or another. And I'm looking at a world where there's a lot of interest in authorship, and a lot of interest in authorship, including in places that you might think would signal a lack of interest in authorship. For example, most literary publications are initially anonymous. Most poems and prose fiction comes out without an author's name attached. Most essay periodicals have pseudonyms, sometimes quite elaborate pseudonyms. Most plays are initially advertised and staged without a playwright's name attached. And so it would be easy to presume, and some people in the past have presumed, that just means that, well, people didn't care about authors. But then you start looking at copies of those publications, and they're full of people having scrawled names of authors on their title pages, supplying what the printed object did not supply.
Is that after the fact, or?
It's after the fact of publication, but sometimes it's like within a week.
Within a week.
And sometimes they seem to show some inside knowledge. There's a whole kind of gossip network about authorship and attribution. Sometimes they seem to be guesses based on more or less solid reasoning. And sometimes they seem to almost be playfully counterintuitive or just so off the mark as to be funny kinds of things. Like there's a copy of The Way to Wealth at the Library Company in Philadelphia, which The Way to Wealth is a compilation of Poor Richard's maxims. So Benjamin Franklin's, maxim about, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, all those things. They get combined into this long, well, not that long, dialogue where someone just keeps on spouting, well, poor Richard says this, poor Richard says this. But the copy, and so if you were just approaching that in a spirit of trying to get it right, presumably you would guess Franklin or someone like that. But the copy at the Library Company says the Duchess of Queensberry.
Oh.
Who is about one of the least Franklinian figures you could possibly come up with. And given what else we know about that copy and the Library Company, which of course was started by Franklin and friends, I'm guessing that someone just thought it would, well, everyone knows this is by Franklin. There's no glory in being able to guess faster than someone else who wrote this. So I'm just going to come up with the most exceedingly implausible candidate possible.
So a joke.
Yeah. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that kind of play around authors that I think both suggests an interest in them and a sense that they are not gods among men, that they exist in some ways for the public's entertainment.
So does that ever change? I'm going to take us out of the 18th century, long or otherwise. So you say there might be a minority, a small number of authors who can live off of their writing. Is there ever a time where the author has that sort of stature? The 19th century, is it Dickens? Is it the 20th century? Is it Norman Mailer? Or is this always the case with authors?
There are always more people trying to write and publish than there seems to be a market to support.
And now there's Substack.
But I think they're a stretch from maybe, I don't know, the 1840s to the 1960s or so, when it was significantly more possible and there was significantly more deference being paid to authors. This is not quite what I'm talking about, but it might help illustrate. My first book was in some ways about 18th century fan fiction. It was about readers who wanted more of beloved characters, and when authors weren't providing it, they just set out to come up with further adventures for Gulliver or Pamela or Falstaff or Tristram Shandy or others. And there, with a few exceptions, the ideas for the character, the author's plans for the characters seemed to have been just blithely disregarded. The author was just like another guy telling stories about this character, and his version was no more authoritative than mine. Whereas contrast that to the 19th century, where you have people writing to Dickens, begging him to please let little Nell live, in the sense that, which suggests that they're kind of deferring to him, that they can make the plea, but ultimately it's going to be his call. And so authors have, in the 19th century, and this is painting with a very broad brush, but thinking that in the 19th and first half, 2/3 of the 20th century, are more easily acceded to authority, and they're more of a sense that they are superior beings, and they might have some genius that others don't have, and that they should be deferred to, the default should be deferring to them rather than having them defer to us.
So I want to talk about another project. You're writing about the book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I've never heard of this book, I have to confess.
It's wonderful. It's a novel from 2004 that I read when it came out, and I have reread probably a dozen times since then. I've taught on a number of occasions. It's really one of my favorites.
So we really are out of the 18th century if it's in 2004.
Well, it's
a very long 18th century.
It's set in the 18 teens. It's set in the Regency. So it's set in a more conventional, long 18th century. They're not still in years that don't begin with the 17. It's this fabulous novel that imagines a kind of an alternate history for England in which there was this vibrant tradition of magic in the late Middle Ages that then kind of wanes through the 16th and 17th century, becomes pretty much just a subject for gentlemanly antiquarians where no one's actually practicing it, and it's kind of vulgar to practice in the 18th century, and then gets revived in the early 19th century with big consequences for the Napoleonic Wars, for all the other things that are so familiar to us from, because that Regency period and that early 19th century more generally is probably one of the periods of the past, other than maybe World War II, that Anglophone readers know best, just because of Jane Austen and the endless Austen adaptations and films, and very popular historical fiction set then, like the Aubrey Maturin naval novels, and there seems to be an endless fascination with Napoleon and such. So it's very cleverly using a lot of the standard techniques of historical fiction, having cameos from well-known historical figures and getting period diction right, and having just little details that show you've done your homework, like having the right kind of fruit knife and things like that. But it's combining that with this clearly counterfactual thing about magic, this invented past in the medieval period where things are much, much different, and then anticipated future in which things will be again different. So, and that I think one of the things that most fascinates me about it is the early 19th century looks a whole lot like the early 19th century that we know, but there are different explanations for everything. So George III has still gone mad, but it's not because of Porphyry. It's because he's been possessed by a fairy. Wellington still wins at Waterloo, but it's because a magician has moved things around rather than because the Prussians showed up at the right time. And so the central period in which it's set is meticulously historically faithful, except for the magic, whereas the imagined medieval past is much different. Among other things, there's a kingdom of southern England and a kingdom of northern England. So there isn't any national unification of the way that there had been since the 11th century. And then at the very close of the novel, magic, which has been practiced by a handful of people during most of the novel, gets democratized. And so there's this vision that whatever the rest of the 19th century looks like, it's not going to look like the 19th century we know. And this is just done in a really smart, clever way. The writer, Susanna Clarke, is able to ventriloquize the period quite well, including doing a credible Austen impression. And there are a lot of the backstory and history of magic that she develops is done in footnotes. I always love notes, and especially in forms like novels that don't usually have them. And it's just a delight. And there's this series published by Paul Grave that is asking for people to make sort of short pitches for what should be in a new canon of science fiction and fantasy. How, once we get beyond, the obvious Tolkien, Lewis, Le Guin suspects, who else should we regard as central to those modes of writing? Who else should we be teaching and writing about? Who else should we be taking seriously and reading carefully in the way that we tend to do with things that are canonical? And I think she belongs. But it's also a chance to write in a kind of advocacy that I don't always get to do. It's almost like that old-fashioned genre of the appreciation.
Well, I was going to say, you're going to be her agent. I'd introduce you as someone who's interested in how magic works. Where did this interest in magic come from?
It's something I think about a lot. I'm not sure I have the best answer because it's not something I can really remember not being interested in.
Okay.
But I grew up in the Wilmington, Delaware suburbs, so basically the greater Philadelphia suburbs. But when I was 4, we moved to Tokyo for 3 years. And that was kind of amazing, just being in a world that did not work in the way that the Philadelphia suburbs worked. And my parents were much freer there than I think that they were before, or certainly since we came back. I think that having a distance from their ordinary lives was good for them. And around that time, I developed an interest in Japanese folklore, which is full of stories about various kinds of non-human creatures and magical goings-on. And so I suspect that I acquired my interest in magic then, and it got tied up with this sort of delight in a way of living that seemed to have more possibilities than the way of living back in Delaware did, especially the way of living back in Delaware with my family, we didn't go to church, but my parents are really Calvinist nonetheless. And so there was a certain kind of constriction that had gotten temporarily relaxed. And I think that part of what fascinates me about magic, both the historical desire to engage in magic, which goes back to antiquity and I think is still very much with us, even if we like to say otherwise. The first day of my course on history of magic and witchcraft, I asked how many students believe in magic, and maybe a quarter will say it. And then I ask how many have astrology apps on their phones, and it's more than twice that.
Of course.
But I think that the magic is in part about being able to exert your will on the world and to not be as constrained by and subject to your circumstances as you would otherwise be. And I suspect the time in Tokyo was my own little version of that.
The last time you and I saw each other before we sat down here was in the main library, where your students from Medieval and Renaissance Studies 5611 were displaying their projects. That course is the history of the book. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the class and about what we saw the day that the students were presenting their work.
Sure. So I teach 2 courses on the history of the book. The Medieval and Renaissance Studies one covers that, really the Renaissance. We start with in the mid-15th century with the invention of movable type, Gutenberg, and go up and through the early 19th century because the techniques for book production don't much change between the 15th and the early 19th century. It's still hand-set pieces of type, handmade on pieces of paper that have been made by hand, sheet by sheet, etc. And I teach a follow-up course that I'm doing right now, English 5612, that is the history of the book in modernity, where we start from the early 19th century and go up to today, or at least yesterday, and where we're thinking much more about the consequences of mechanization, where printing is no longer being done through muscle power, but through steam or electric power. Paper is made in big rolls rather than sheet by sheet. Bindings rather than being built up around a book one by one, or separate cases into which a text block gets slotted and glued, and so on. And the final project for all of these book history classes, and I've been doing this since, I want to say, 2012, 2013, is an exhibition where the students select material from the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library's collection and make an exhibit out of it. And the idea is that it's a collectively curated single exhibit, so that they each will have a portion. We call it their case, but it's really a table. Yeah. But that is part of a larger whole that they're seeing. We're getting, say, an exhibition with 7 curators rather than 7 mini exhibitions. And it's a kind of writing that they have almost never been asked to do before, because they're writing labels for the individual items, they're writing labels for their cases, they're writing wall text for the exhibition as a whole. And so it's much less in terms of a word count than standard paper for a class would be. But A, the words have to be perfect, and B, you're writing for the public rather than writing for your teacher. And that involves trying to anticipate what the public will know and won't know, what might interest them. And every year they've done it, the students come up with a different organizing theme or a set of questions. In the autumn, the exhibition that you went to was playing on the 70s ecological motto of the reduce, reuse, recycle, because so many aspects of early modern books involve reusing materials that had previously had another life. Paper is made from linen rags, which had previously been shirts and underwear. Leather bindings are made from the skins of animals, which had been previously using them as skins, and so on. But also, there's lots of reprinting, lots of selecting and reduction. And I thought they did some very clever things with it, and
it was very impressive.
And they
very
found,
impressive display.
And they always find objects that I didn't even know were in the collection. I mean, I certainly don't know all that's in the collection. It's, I think, upwards of 100,000 books. But I've worked with it a lot over the years, and I'm always delighted by what they find.
Well, I think this is the third class I've seen, and I'm just impressed every time I see it. So
I think it's one of my favorite things to teach here, and the students always rise to the occasion, and I think it's a memorable experience for them, and it's a chance for them to actually, I think, make that switch, which is really important in classes, but also hard to pull off, of going from being a student of something to a practitioner of something.
They're very knowledgeable. Whenever I spoke with them, it's clear they're very knowledgeable.
So I really like that as an assignment, as a goal that we're building toward. I like it as a way for students to really use the collections in a significant and substantive way, because there are lots and lots of headaches associated with being part of a huge university. And if you just wanted to sit in a classroom and, talk about a novel, you could probably do it at least as well, probably maybe better, at a liberal arts college. But OSU has some fabulous resources. And I think there's been kind of a practice, it's less so now than when I showed up, but still I see it, of trying to shield undergraduates from that. And that seems silly. If you're going to deal with the headaches of going to OSU, you should at least also be able to draw upon the resources of it. And this is my way of doing that.
Right. And you mentioned Rare Books and Manuscripts, and there's not a better resource, I think, anywhere. Tell us what's next. What are you working on next?
I think I'm finally going to get out of the 18th century.
Okay.
I have long had a side interest in the mid-20th century U.S., but I've never really written about it for publication. Like I did my favorite project in graduate school was not my dissertation, but was a seminar paper I did on the Reader's Digest condensed books.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's something about, especially the 40s and 50s, that I find really fascinating, and I have some psychological theories about that. But one of the aspects of that period I find really fascinating are pulp magazines. And that's where I think a lot of the kinds of writing that modernisms have rejected were kept alive. That's where adventure stories and science fiction and other things that, the Fitzgeralds of the world couldn't be bothered with kept going. They're fascinating objects. They have these often really lurid covers. They have fascinating ads, many of them involving improving yourself by becoming a radio repairman.
Yes.
They have letters columns sometimes where fans are writing in and finding each other in kind of a sort of virtual community of other fans. And so I have two things on the horizon that involve the pulps. One would be doing an exhibition in the main Thompson Library Gallery of pulp magazines with one of the curators from Rare Books and Manuscripts, because we have a very good collection, and they are objects that students seem to always respond to, and I think people in the broader Columbus public might be interested as well. And the other is one of the fantasy series that I read a lot as a kid and keep on going back to. It's a series of stories by Fritz Leiber about a man named Fafford and a man named the Gray Mouser. And they are in that kind of mid-century swords and sorcery, kind of down and dirty kind of fantasy. It's not high-minded. It's not saving the world. They're out for themselves. But I've always enjoyed them, and I think a lot of other people kind of are feeling their influence, even if they never read them, because that is a lot of what went into things like Dungeons and Dragons, and
Sure.
which in turn has shaped lots of other things. So they're getting Fritz Leiber like fourth hand. But one of the things that interests me about Leiber is he published something like 45 stories about these two over from the late 30s to the late 70s, so over 40 years, and mostly in the pulps. And they're not in chronological order. They're in probably close to 20 different venues. And I'm interested in how readers kind of come up with ideas of them as coherent, charismatic characters when they're getting them in such snippets and pieces, and there's not a clear, the publication order does not line up with any kind of internal biography for them. And so it seems like a interesting test both for how character can be created in that dispersed kind of serial publishing environment, but also in the kinds of work, cognitive work really, that go into assembling someone who could seem like a coherent figure, the Gray Mouser, from all these different little fragments, and there's no, unless you're a serious collector, there's no guarantee that any given reader is going to be encountering all of them. And so what's involved in working from those more partial bits. So in some ways, it's a chance to put together questions I've thought about as a grown up with reading I did as a kid.
David Brewer, thank you.
Thank you.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.